Szanowni Państwo, ruszyła nasza transmisja na YouTubie, więc pozwolę sobie przejść już na język angielski i myślę, że możemy rozpoczynać. So let me just begin. I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Hello, and welcome to our A+ Lectures program and this special event today. Now, it's 5 o'clock now on the 14th of December, and this special event should commence at this moment. Now, my name is Marek Łukasik, and I'm Vice Rector for Development and Cooperation at Pomeranian University in Słupsk. And let me just say that this event today is hosted or co-hosted by the Instytut of History and the Office for Development and Cooperation of our university. Let me just say a few words about the program itself. Now, the A+ Lectures program is our outreach program, which is realized within a big project, which is called Active University Project, which is carried out by Pomeranian University in Słupsk. Now, the aim of the project itself is to accomplish the third mission of the university, whereas the A+ Lectures program is to boost our international outreach and also to invite top-class experts who will deliver world-class knowledge, research results to our students, PhD candidates, our research fellows, but also to the general public. So I'm really happy that today we have a special guest who accepted our invitation to this event. And let me just say a few words. First of all, if you don't mind, about the event tonight from the technical perspective. First of all the participants are asked to ask questions through the chat box, either on YouTube or the chat box that you can see on our webinar platform. That's one of the most important things at the moment, because if you want to ask a question, do this through this chat box. You can ask questions in both English and Polish, and later on we will be able to read out those questions to Professor Patrice Dabrowski, and I will just introduce you in a minute. But first, let me just say that this technical thing is an important thing for everybody to remember. Now, our YouTube broadcast will stay as a recording. So in case you want to invite your students, in case you want to share the link, that's specifically there and it's available. Now, let me just say that again, that the Institute of History co-hosts this event tonight. And the moderator tonight is Professor Robert Kuśnierz of the Institute. But it's our sheer pleasure to have Professor Patrice Dabrowski tonight from Harvard Center for European Studies, who will deliver this lecture. But I would like, Robert, you to introduce Professor Dabrowski to our listeners. So I will just thank you for now. And Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vice Rector. Good morning, Patrice, once again. First of all, I would like to stress that it's a great honor and pleasure to have you here. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation to deliver us a lecture concerning a very important case from our Polish perspective, namely how Americans perceive our history, what Americans know about Polish history, and what they should know about Polish history. So the topic sounds very interesting, and we are looking forward for your talk. I would like also to welcome all other participants from Poland. I greet my colleagues from the Institute, my students, PhD students, and all who are interested in history. Let me say a few words about our guest today, about Professor Patrice Dabrowski. Professor Dabrowski received her PhD from Harvard University. She has taught and worked at Harvard, Brown, the University of Massachusetts and Amherst, and the University of Vienna, Austria. Professor Dabrowski is currently a local affiliate of the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. She's also a member of the board of directors of the Polish Institute of Arts and Science of America, based in New York City. Her scholarly interests include Polish and East Central European history. Professor Dabrowski has published many works on that, including 3 books. I think that the most important from our perspective is the second book, Poland, the First 1,000 Years. Patrice, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that your book about this book, that the First 1,000 Years, is the second after Norman Davies' work that concerns the complete Polish history and is directed to the Anglo-Saxon readers. Professor Dabrowski was awarded a number of grants and postdoctoral fellowships, among others in 2014. The President of the Republic of Poland awarded her the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. Her most recent award is the Mary Zirin Prize that she received from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. As you can see, we have a very prominent guest, a very distinguished scholar, very competent in Polish history. So we are looking forward to your lecture, Patrice. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, let me thank, first of all, Vice Rector Łukasik and Professor Kuśnierz for their kind invitation to address all of you here today and for that kind introduction. And now I must deal with technical side of things. And here we go. Very good. So you can see my screen, I hope.
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. So, what do Americans know about Polish history? Before I turn to this question, let me pose one to you, one that I have been pondering ever since I was invited to give this talk. Why are Poles always so interested in what Americans know about Polish history? I wonder whether you ask foreigners the same question. Or is the American point of view from across the Atlantic simply that much more interesting? Perhaps I should turn the question around and ask, what does the average Pole know about American history? The assumption being that in most countries, the history that is taught is one's own history. My questions notwithstanding, I have indeed agreed to explain what Americans know about Polish history here today. I will provide 2 answers, one shorter, the other a bit longer. That will let you know what Americans on the whole know about Polish history. And I will tell you why that might be the case. I'll also share with you some of the points I tried to make when teaching 1,000 Years of Polish History, a course that inspired the writing of my book, Poland, the First 1,000 Years. We'll conclude by considering how to change Poland's image abroad. So the easy, simple answer to the question of what do Americans know about Polish history is nothing, or practically nothing. The average American hardly knows United States history, let alone European history, of which Polish history can be considered a subset. Most Americans could not identify Poland as a Slavic country. Most probably don't know what Slavic means. I would warrant that many could not find Poland on a map. I know from my own teaching how weak a command of geography many students have. But back to European history. Surely it is taught in the United States. Well, European history is not a required subject in our schools, by which I mean elementary, middle, and high schools, the first 12 years of schooling. Instead of history, what is often taught is a course called social studies. At the high school level, grades 9 through 12, when pupils generally have a degree of choice in what they want to take, even those interested in history can choose not to take European history. For example, to take a course in world history instead. Now, surely the experience of students at colleges and universities in the United States is different, you ask. But even at that undergraduate or college level, European history is not required in many programs. More likely these days would be a history of Western thought or global history, which is very popular today. Thus, these days, even many history majors, that is, students who come to the college to study history, do not study European history as a subject in itself. And when they do, introductory survey courses tend to focus on what one would term the West, traditionally, the British Isles, France, perhaps Germany. Those are the countries that figure most prominently in the narrative of the rise of the West since the 17th century. Other countries are covered only at moments when not covering them would distort the narrative. Let's consider the case of Poland here as presented in textbooks and general accounts of European and world history. In most tellings of European history, one is lucky to hear Poland mentioned at all. It figures only sporadically, coming in and out of the picture, seemingly more out than in, and often history textbooks get the facts wrong. The picture of Poland has often been unflattering. The country often receives first mention in conjunction with the late 18th century partitions of Poland. That is precisely at the moment when it disappears from the map of Europe for over a century. This disappearance was generally presented as something almost inevitable or natural by the partitioning powers of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. There were good reasons, so the argument goes, for the Poles to be denied independent statehood. Now, in accounts of 20th century history, Poland's trajectory has long been seen as depressing. The country generally is mentioned as one of the new states created after World War I, a period when it did much to overcome the effects of over 100 years of partition. You know that Poland likewise saved Europe from the communist menace in 1920, defeating Bolshevik Russia in the Polish-Soviet War. But these accomplishments are rarely mentioned. The country disappears from the map again during World War II, the victim of yet another partition, this time by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And as you know, the Polish cavalry did not charge German tanks, Nazi German propaganda to the contrary. Polish soldiers fought valiantly, waiting for the country's allies, Britain and France, both of whom had a promise to attack anyone who attacked Poland. But no attack was forthcoming at this crucial moment. Now, after the painful caesura that was World War II, again, as you see, a period in which the country does receive some mention in history textbooks, Poland becomes subsumed within an area called variously Eastern Europe or the East or Soviet bloc. This correctly suggests that many general works of history assumed that any references to the Soviet Union would by extension apply to the countries of Eastern Europe. Indeed, at least one history textbook saw fit to write in its index, "See Soviet Union," under the entry for Eastern Europe. Thus, the picture of Poland, insofar as the country has been depicted at all, has tended to be depressing. The only hope during periods of oppression lay in something called the Polish question. This phenomenon referred to the Poles' seemingly impertinent or even provocative demand for independent statehood, something they considered their right. The question was a feature of what is often called the long 19th century, a period when there was no independent Polish state. Yet this period established the idea of Poland as it appears in courses on or readings in European and world history. It was seen as a paradoxical, even problematic country. According to some interpretations, Poland did not deserve to exist as during World War II, or else was fated by its unfavorable geopolitical position to exist only as part of the Soviet bloc. History tends to be written by the victors. Given that the modern history profession dates from a period when there was no Polish state, we should not be surprised that Poland has so often been presented in such a sporadic, unflattering, even disheartening way. It has often been in the interest of the victors to underestimate, downplay, or even obscure the history of the losers. So much for Poland in the period prior to 1989, as depicted in many historical surveys of European history. Now, of course, times have changed since the bad old days of communism. Over a quarter century has passed since then. Polish history is no longer a totally depressing story. One reason why I believed it needed to be told anew and wrote my own history of Poland, Poland the First 1,000 Years, first published in 2014. This, in a nutshell, is how many historians of Europe have presented Poland. Yet not all European historians in the United States are as ill-informed as that today. Indeed, since 1989, the numbers of historians writing on Polish topics has grown. Although in recent years there has been a crisis in academia, which means that there are fewer and fewer positions for professors of European history, let alone East European or Polish history. Just like me, many of my historian colleagues were captivated by what they saw in Poland in the 1980s, or they were taught by people who were. They too research and write books about aspects of Polish history. Many of them teach history at the United States colleges and universities. So what can I say about how they teach Polish history? And here I must share the painful truth with you. Few history departments in American colleges and universities offer courses in Polish history. These tend to be limited to a few universities with a chair in Polish history or program in Polish studies. And here I am not talking about where the Polish language and literature are being taught. I simply don't have enough information about them. So the places I'm talking about are universities such as the University of Michigan, where, for example, Poland from the medieval to the modern and Poland in the modern world are taught. The University of Wisconsin at Madison offers a similarly titled course, A History of Poland in the World. With a chair in Polish and Polish American history, Central Connecticut State University offers the course Modern Poland once a year. Columbia University's courses with Poland in the title this year are Culture in Polish Lands and 20th Century Poland in Personal Accounts. Now, things are more promising exactly where you might expect, in the heart of American Polonia, Chicago. At the University of Illinois at Chicago, 2 Polish historians teach a number of courses. And here on the slide, I've listed courses by the holder of the chair of Polish history, which you see is a whole range of courses of different aspects of Polish history. Let me go back here for a second. There we go. In a similar fashion to myself, one colleague at a university without a Polish program nonetheless teaches Polish history. She offers a course titled Between Nazism and Communism. Under this clever title, she presents the history of Poland from medieval times to the present. But few colleagues do the same. Indeed, few can. For many of my peers, that is faculty members at universities across the United States who have written books on Polish history, cannot offer courses in Polish history. Enough students would not sign up for them to fill the course. So they might teach Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe before 1914, Eastern Europe since 1914, as is done at Yale University, for example. And here you see a list of similar titles that are offered by my colleagues across the United States. Yet others teach courses on Cold War history, on the World Wars, or the history of the Holocaust, and so on. Some professors resort to teaching thematic courses with a Polish content. To share but several examples of these, colleagues offer courses such as From the Locomotive to the Smartphone, Culture, Space, and Time in the Machine Age, or Eurometro, Visions of the European Metropolis, or even a course called Restless Women. What does this have to do with Poland, you ask? Well, not everything is political history. In this way, colleagues present parts of their own research and writing on Poland. This, importantly, is also a way of normalizing Polish history. Poland is a country with its own history, just like other countries across the globe. Polish cities can fruitfully be compared to other European cities. Examples for a women's history course can include Matka Polka or Polish feminists, and so on. My colleagues who teach only Western civilization courses or courses on Russian and German history at their universities also know how to insert some Polish history into them. Ukrainian and Jewish historians also often have a Polish component in their courses. There are, of course, various ways of thinking about Polish history and how to reach students. You might also be interested to see who takes Polish history courses and why. So here, let me share some data from my own experience teaching Central and Eastern European history, including Polish history. I have offered the course 1,000 Years of Polish History to undergraduates, that is, to college students. Places where I have taught include Harvard, Brown, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Whenever I teach the course, I ask students to fill out an index card with their contact information, travel background, foreign languages they know, as well as 2 short statements: why they chose to take this course and what they associate with the words Poland and Poles. There are approximately 6 answers to the question of why they chose to take the course, and I will give them here in no particular order. I am of Polish descent. I was once in Poland or this part of Europe. I'm intrigued by a course that covers 1,000 years in 1 semester. I want to learn about a part of Europe that is less familiar. I like esoteric topics. Or this is the only course in European history being offered this semester. I should add that the answers to these questions vary from school to school. Students at a major private university like Harvard are more likely to have traveled, while those at a state or public university tend to be less well-traveled. Most of the students who sign up for my 1,000 Years of Polish History course are majoring in history or similar subjects, although I've had students from other fields also sign up. But back to my survey. I also asked students what comes to mind when you hear the words Poland or Pole. That is, what they could associate with the country or nation. And here is an answer that comes up a lot. World War II. After all, Poland is where World War II began. Other students with a bit more knowledge might mention the name Lech Wałęsa or the year 1989. Some have even more sophisticated answers, but many nonetheless choose to avoid naming names as they find them difficult to spell correctly. Still, you may wonder, where is Kościuszko? Where is Pułaski? Where is Polonia? That is, what about the Polish Americans? And here I have a caveat. I cannot talk about the tiny number of American children of Polish descent who go to Polonia-organized Saturday schools where language and perhaps some history is taught. It is too tiny, too atypical a group to include for consideration here. I must add that being a descendant of immigrants, I was never exposed to such instruction. So what I can talk about is my experience with today's college students. When I taught at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, sometimes students claimed to be of Polish descent, as Western Massachusetts is a place where many Poles settled in the late 19th century. Yet, there is only a tenuous link to Polishness, mostly family traditions, cuisine, and the like. Practically no one knows any Polish, even enough to pronounce their surnames as a Pole would. Thus, these students are in the same situation as their non-Polish American peers. For many students, Poland might as well be in the moon, per the famous quotation. But that is at the outset. By the end of this semester, they have learned a good deal of Polish history, over 1,000 years worth of Polish history. But I must emphasize, they are among the relatively few students in the United States who are able to take a course in Polish history. Again, at the outset, they don't have many associations or much knowledge of Poland on which to build. They, like most Americans, know European history and geography only superficially. So, some conclusions. They know next to nothing about Poland. Many have few associations with Poland or Poles. They barely know where Poland lies and in what neighborhood, but they sign up for my course. Still, the task is not hopeless. Polish history is interesting, complicated but interesting. Still, they find the names and toponyms unpronounceable. So how do I present Polish history? First, as a challenge for the historian, thus as a subject worth studying. In the course of 1,000 years, much happened. The country and people changed dramatically. And not only Poles figure in Polish history, one needs to take into account a broader context and larger cast of characters. So, how do I teach Polish history and what are some of the themes I emphasize? This is the course summary for my course. This course surveys Polish history from its medieval beginnings through the events of 1989 and beyond. Topics include the influence of both West and East on Polish culture, the evolution of the medieval Polish state into a great multi-ethnic and multi-denominational commonwealth, the loss of independent statehood during the long 19th century, the Poles' fight for freedom, the establishment of a state in 1918, its transformation and Sovietization following World War II, the emergence of the Solidarity movement, the collapse of communism and rise of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. My course has a midterm and final examination. Students complete primary source analyses and they write a book review. There are no prerequisites, which means there's no course they have to have taken prior to this course in history. So I begin by disabusing students of the impression that Polish history is straightforward by reviewing a series of maps, all done to scale. And I'm going to share these with you. I tell them that the 1,000-year-plus old country we call Poland has been a moving target, geographically as well as demographically. So this is how Poland is situated today. It is one of the larger European countries in a sea of nation states. If we go back a millennium, we have the early medieval state. On this map, it does resemble the present-day polity in both size and location. But jump forward to the 14th century, or this map is this mid-16th century, this much larger pink entity extending across Central and Eastern Europe is the late medieval and early modern permutation of Poland. Most students have no idea that so much of the region had once been under Polish control. Why might that be the case? Fast forward several centuries, and we have no Poland at all. The state makes a new appearance after World War I, and this is what it looks like. Somewhat smaller than in the early modern period, but still significant. Out of the ashes of World War II, which was an unmitigated disaster for the Poles, a period when again there was no Polish state, here comes a new incarnation of Poland, a Poland in pretty much the borders we see today and to which we return. So the upshot of all this, there is simply no single piece of territory that has been part of a Polish state throughout the country's entire history. But geography is not everything. We still have the demographic or human aspect to consider, but it is a no less messy proposition. For the very definition of who is a Pole has not been constant either. In sum, Polish history does not seem to be your average national history. So the challenge for students, Polish history is not straightforward or simple. The territory of Poland changes drastically, and even the definition of the term Pole changes dramatically depending on the period. In other words, they can't take anything for granted. They have to think and pay close attention throughout the semester. So this in itself is a terrific lesson for history students. I furthermore need to define what a nation or naród is, as the term is used differently in English, sometimes meaning the same thing as country or kraj. So we have on one hand the country or state, kraj or państwo, and on the other hand we have the nation or people or naród as something completely different, and the students need to understand that. Now, I don't plan on giving you my full course in Polish history here today, but let me share with you a bit of my approach. I focus not on Polish victimhood, but rather on what I call Polish creative thinking. That is how Poles extracted themselves from difficult or challenging situations. For one, we have the challenge of tricky transitions. For example, when a dynasty dies out, Poles had to deal with the dead ends for the Piast rulers, for its Angevin rulers, and of course its Jagiellons. Poles managed to come up with interesting solutions which ultimately led to a greater influence in Europe. For one, these transitions led to a greater ethnic and religious heterogeneity, as with the joining together of Poland and Lithuania. Ideas from the West, such as Western Christianity and the Renaissance and so forth, were absorbed and shared further east. Or north, let's not forget of the attractiveness of Poland-Lithuania for what would come to be called Royal Prussia. And in the course of these various transitions and succession crises, the noble nation gained in status and strength. Of course, the most interesting and most original solution was the utterly novel creation of the Commonwealth, or Rzeczpospolita, out of two nations and two states. If my students don't understand this phenomenon, how will they understand the rest of Polish and East Central European history? Oh, here we go back to that slide again. There we go. So take the concept of citizenship as reflected in the multi-ethnic noble Sarmatian nation, complete with its own myth of origin. The noble nation would come to be understood as the Polish nation, with only nobles regarded as Poles. Students need to know that this was nonetheless a country of many cultures with a deep history. It was one reason that toleration and freedom of religion were enshrined in the Confederation of Warsaw. There was no cuius regio eius religio, like in the West, where wars of religion were fought. Minority voices were also respected to the extent that consensus and unanimity were to prevail in politics. When not abused, this was a good system in a multi-ethnic country where regions had different interests. And indeed, this was the price of freedom. For such a heterogeneous country to be able to function, Poles had to be able to reach consensus or agreement. At its best, the concept of freedom in the Polish lands was active and not anarchic. A freedom to, as versus a freedom from. The nobles of the noble nation were to keep the common good, the res publica, in mind when deliberating. The model of citizenship became attractive, perhaps too much so. How so? Well, it was good to be a nobleman with privileges, also to have the right to elect the king. In the 16th century, we speak of Poland's golden age. This was a Polish success story. Yet in the next century, the Commonwealth is faced with the problem of its Cossack fighters. Nobles were nobles as virtue of their historic defense of the country. Yet Cossacks also helped to defend the Commonwealth. They aspired to be part of the nobility, to have the cherished freedoms. The crisis of the mid-17th century served as a caesura for the Commonwealth. The Civil War, as well as Swedish invasion, left the Commonwealth reeling. Following this period, magnates became less concerned with the common good and more with their own fortunes. This led to a debasement of Sarmatism, increased xenophobia, among other things. Yet, while that was true, it was not the country's faults alone that led to its ultimate demise. Here I present a corrective to views of a Polish anarchy that seemingly justified the partitions. That was the story told by the Commonwealth's partitioners, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They sought to justify the partitions in this way. But we know that wasn't the whole story. Here one needs to speak of the Polish Enlightenment, especially of the 4-year or Great Sejm that produced the foundational document, the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, the second constitution in the world behind the American one. And this, of course, is of great interest to American students. We study the document to understand better how this creative thinking proved that the country was capable of reforming itself. It was these signs of vitality that the partitioning powers felt compelled to squelch, hence the second and third partitions. But was this finis Poloniae? As Lord Acton once observed, with the partitions of the Commonwealth, one witnessed the birth of nationality in Europe. Members of the Polish community who were invested in their country and nation persisted in trying to achieve independence after the partitions. There were various signs of creative thinking in the long 19th century. Recall, for example, the insurrectionary slogan, "For our freedom and yours, za naszą a waszą wolność." Likewise, perhaps beginning with Kościuszko, one had the broadening of the concept of the nation to include non-nobles, such as his peasant scythemen. Another way to think about this was the ennoblement of the entire population, beginning with some rich townspeople already during the 4-year Sejm. Poles gave thought to what it meant to be Polish, and they had to decide whether they wanted to be Polish. For Russia, Russian, Prussian, and Austrian were other options for identity. Again, I warrant that it is hard to understand the 20th century without a sense of the Polish fight for freedom. And Americans could take a great interest in freedom fighters. So why do we speak of the history of Poland after 1795, after the country ceases to exist? Well, the 19th century was the history of a modernizing nation, despite its being stateless. New nations were emerging, not only Polish, but also Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish, on the same territory that had once belonged to the Commonwealth. Much was going on within the partition zones, not to mention in immigration. The story was not all insurrections. Let us not forget organic work in positivism, which helped to lay the foundation for the broadening of Polish society. The 20th century is more easily understood when one traces the experiences of Poland and the Poles. From statelessness to imperfect nation statehood, to double partition, subsequent Sovietization, and ultimately independence once more. This is where Poland should fit neatly into a general history of Europe as well as world history. The history of Poland is at times of world historical significance. Poland's pertinence to European and world history thus can be variously perceived. With the country's accession to the European Union in 2004, its history has or should become an integral part of European history. Poland is seen, for better or worse, as part of the new Europe. Yet such an approach suggests that Poland, despite its being the largest country of this new cohort, is but an appendage, a country on the outskirts of Europe, whose history could conceivably be included in a broader history of the continent, rather than a major player in its own right. Such an interpretation does not do justice to the roles played by the country and its people in the past. If one reads history backwards, one should not underestimate the role that Poles have played in bringing down the prevalent European or world systems. In the most recent past, Poles, again united in the movement known as Solidarity, contributed to the collapse of communism in the East. Even prior to that, Poles and their desire for independent statehood likewise helped to undermine the great Central and East European empires of the long 19th century. These accomplishments stemmed from the unique experience of Poles in the early modern period. Poland, or rather the Commonwealth, was long a big player in Central and Eastern Europe. While the country was not itself an empire, in a certain incarnation, it was the largest political entity in this part of Europe, one that had a multi-ethnic population. You can think of it as Europe writ small. This pre-modern Polish permutation represented the pinnacle of Polish creativity, a road not taken by other countries within Europe during that period. Citizens of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth valued democratic, consensual, constitutional approaches long before such ideas were embraced by the rest of Europe. The country also was strong enough to become a federative state, allowing a patchwork of peoples and territories to join of their own accord in the Polish experiment. Some might consider this particular Polish permutation a precursor of sorts to the European Union. That Poland weathered the global economic crisis significantly better than much of the continent suggests that even in the 21st century, there may be some lessons to be learned from both Poles and Poland. Such, anyway, were my thoughts when writing my book several years back. Indeed, my telling of Polish history in Poland the first 1,000 years is for the most part upbeat. I write of Polish creativity in the face of crises. But not only. When I was writing my book several years ago, I finished my first draft in 2012, Poland's star appeared to be in the ascendant. After a quarter century, the so-called return to Europe seemed to be complete. Polish politicians were figuring more prominently in European politics. The reputation of the country as an East European success story seemed to be secure, as indeed did the fate of Europe itself. It seemed to me then that one could go back to Polish history and present some parts of it as eminently worth introducing to Americans and anyone else who would read a 450-page book on the subject. Yet the situation has changed since then. I am no political scientist, but I do follow developments in the country. Today, Polish politics are much more reminiscent of the turmoil of recent American politics, or perhaps vice versa. This is a surprising turn in a country that appeared to be the poster child of success insofar as European integration was concerned, not to mention the fact that it was the first domino to topple in the 1989 collapse of communism. Now, I don't mean to get into politics here, but as a historian, what I see as necessary is a sincere and honest approach to one's own history and to history in general, based on evidence and not wishful thinking or propaganda. There is a need to understand others as well as oneself. And there is no room for an inferiority complex. All nations have better and worse moments. That's simply the way things are. We need to learn from the past and try to transcend it, making the future a better place. So, how can one change the image of Poland abroad? The focus on Polish victimhood gets the country nowhere. That is only a losing game. There are too many people in the world who are defensive and easy to take offense at everything. It is better to emphasize what the Poles have been able to accomplish, to show Poland as a source of inspiration, innovation, creativity. Polish history is not a tale of helpless Polish victims incapable of doing anything to help themselves. Poles were not powerless pawns in big power politics. Indeed, those who read my book will see that Poles were able to influence outcomes, even some outcomes that affected not only the history of their own country, but that of their neighbors as well. More than that, some outcomes involving Polish actors were of world historical significance. Again, I may be prejudiced, but I would warrant that Poles have as interesting a historical profile as any of the peoples of this part of the world, arguably the most interesting. Among other things, they have boldly forged their own unique type of government and embraced diversity within their state borders. Poles have also been the quintessential freedom fighters, fighters for the freedom of other nations as well as their own. It seems a pity that today Poland is being included in one university in a course with the title Democratic Backsliding. Would not Defenders of Democracy sound better for a course title? So, to end, I would like to borrow two slogans from Poland's past. I realize they have different historical connotations that I won't go into here, but I think the emphasis should be not on the pessimistic statement, Poland stands by unrule, Polska nierządem stoi, but rather the more optimistic, a Pole can do it, or Polak potrafi. It is that kind of approach that will gain Poland more friends and attention, so that the country might not be relegated to the status of a faraway country about which we know nothing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. But I mean, Robert, I will give the floor to you as a moderator. I see some questions coming in, but first, Robert, please.
Thank you very much, Patrice. Your talk was really great. I totally agree with your last thesis that we have to focus not on this on this period as when we are talking about Poland as victim, yes, but we have to talk. About Poland as a source of inspiration. So we've just learned that Polish history is complicated but interesting. So thank you very much once again, Patrice. So now it is the time for discussion. As Vice Rector said, all of you can ask questions. You have to write them. You can do it in both English or in Polish. Więc możecie Państwo albo po angielsku, albo po polsku. If you write in Polish, Professor will be answering in Polish. So maybe I'll start the discussion. So because I have only this chat box here in Click Meeting platform, so I see that there are some thank you notes. And no questions yet. Well, Patrice, I would like to ask the following questions. From time to time, our media inform that some American papers or even public figures use the very, I think, offensive and historically untrue term the Polish death camps or the Polish concentration camps in reference to concentration camps that were built and run by Germans in German-occupied Poland during World War II. And the question is, what Americans know about the Polish-Jewish relations during the war, during the Second War? Do they know something about such great Polish heroes like Irena Sendler in Polish, Irena Sendlerowa, who not only saved many Jewish children from the death, but also saved their personalities. After the war, these Jewish children were able to find out about who they are and who their parents were. So could you please tell us something more about this Polish-Jewish relations?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question, Robert. Of course, it's very unfortunate whenever the term Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps appears. And I think everyone who knows anything about the history of Poland tries to correct that assumption, because of course it does nothing to promote the actual history of Poland and Polish-Jewish relations. It was the Nazi Germans who were in charge of those camps, even if they happened to be somewhere on what had been Polish territory at the time, or what would later also be Polish territory. For Auschwitz was actually within the Reich during the war. We have to remember that as well. But as far as Polish-Jewish relations are concerned, I do have friends who teach courses in that subject. I may add, I can think of one offhand that teaches a course called Poland and the Holocaust, which focuses on that relationship, among other things. But I do not think that most Americans have a very good idea of the extent of Polish-Jewish relations during the war. I would not expect that Irena Sendler would be a name familiar to most. What I could say is that in recent times, there's been more information about how Poles helped to uncover the fact of the Holocaust. So, for example, Pilecki might be a little bit better known than Irena Sendler, for example. But again, that is also talking about people who are already somewhat knowledgeable about Polish history. I don't think that the average American would have even that sort of association. And unfortunately, one has to constantly correct these bad impressions that are fostered by the use of the terms that you mentioned at the outset of your question, Robert.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is it is in Polish. Professor Wojciech Skóra from the Instytut of History ask pytanie in Polish. Jaki wpływ na wiedzę o historii Polski ma wiedza Amerykanów o przebiegu Holokaustu? Or in English or in Polish?
No to jest dobre pytanie. Niech zobaczę, jak mogę na to odpowiedzieć. Jaki wpływ na wiedzę o historii Polski ma wiedza Amerykanów o przebiegu Holokaustu? To raczej mało. Raczej mało. Nie jestem bynajmniej pewna, że większość Amerykanów kojarzą Polskę z Holokaustem. Dla Amerykanów to Holokaust to jest raczej historia Żydów przede wszystkim. No i jednak jak ktoś zna historię Polski, to będzie wiedzieć bardziej, jak to wszystko wyglądało w rzeczywistości. Znaczy w naszych kursach, znaczy tutaj mówię o profesorach, którzy mogą, którzy mają różne kursy, bo w sumie ja mam koleżankę na przykład, która nie może uczyć historii Polski, a za to uczy historii Nazi Germany, czyli o Niemczech w czasie wojny. No ale ona ciągle wprowadza temat Polski do tej historii, jak tylko może. Więc wszystko zależy o kim mówimy, jeśli chodzi o odpowiedź na to pytanie, ale trudno właściwie powiedzieć, że znaczy ja bym nie powiedziała, że kojarzą się Polskę automatycznie z Holokaustem. To są inne kraje przecież też, gdzie Holokaust miało miejsce, prawda? I ten cały region, co Timothy Snyder nazwał Bloodlands, czyli jak to po polsku, ziemie krawione.
Krawione ziemie.
Tak, no to może mają więcej takie rozeznanie.
Okay, thank you. Jacek Guzowski asked a very interesting question. How do students react to a stereotype of a typical Pole?
A stereotype of a typical Pole. Well, who is a typical Pole? I guess would be the question here. I will admit that once upon a time when I was very young, there used to be something called Polak jokes. This was a time when people had jokes about all kinds of different nationalities within the United States, and Polak was one of those categories. I haven't heard one of those in decades, so I don't think that that is a typical Polish stereotype. I don't know what a typical Polish is considered to be by Americans. Again, I don't think most of them think much about Poles. They may think of them as Catholics, perhaps. They may associate Poland with John Paul II, of course, the famous Polish Pope. So that would probably be closer to the stereotype of a typical Pole. But again, I don't think that's something that most people give much thought to.
Thank you. I do not see more questions here in this Click Meeting platform, and I do not have access to YouTube. So you wrote that there are some more questions. So could you please?
Yes, I have access. So I'm going through the list now, if you will. So yes, so there is Arianna from Hungary with 3 questions. First of all, she wanted to thank you for this interesting and great and thought-provoking presentation. So there is a big thank you note here. But there are those questions following. The first one reads, why are we so curious to know what Americans think or know about us? So that's the first question. And then I will read out the others. Patrice?
Well, that's a question that I was posing to all of you, is why Poles are. And I mean, my assumption would be, when I gave this some thought, it may be because of the superpower status of the United States, why Poles really want their history to be known by Americans, because of the size of the country, perhaps because of its general status, because there are people in the United States who are Polish Americans, and so the assumption is that there must be some understanding of who Poles are. But I'd love to hear what all of you think is the answer to that question. Why are Poles so curious? So I will leave that. I will listen to the other 2 questions from the.
Yeah, I mean, there was the actually the other entry here in chat by Jacek, who wrote that Poles feel that Poland does not receive enough respect internationally, and that's why they often refer to history that they are so proud of, hoping that it will change others' perspective about Poland. So, I mean, this is one of our listeners' really thoughts about that. So
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So this has come as well. So the second question. So Ariana asks this other question: why are we so sensitive when they put the East European countries into the same big communist bloc? I mean, yeah.
Well, again, I expected that someone might ask something like this, because I know Poland considers itself to be Central Europe today. And indeed, in official United States parlance, it is part of Central Europe. What I will say about the teaching of Polish history in courses on Eastern Europe, universities don't change very rapidly. Their categorization of Poland in Eastern Europe dates back from decades. And they usually, when Central Europe is mentioned, one thinks only of Germany and Austria. So Poland is in this great big bucket of countries that are quite diverse. that at one point had been part of the Soviet or East Bloc, but obviously is distinct from what you would call now today Eastern Europe, which would be the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, I think is probably how most people think of it. But I don't think there should be any reason to be sensitive about this. I mean, because it also reflects some knowledge of history, that there was indeed something called Eastern Europe, and it existed for almost half a century in the 20th century. So that is already some sign of knowledge of the history of the region.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. And this last question is really linked probably to your interaction with your students. So the question goes, are Americans interested in what we know about them in Eastern Europe? And yes, thank you for your answers.
Well, to tell you the truth, since I'm a person who focuses on teaching Polish history, I don't usually get questions of that kind from my students. Americans are not so, how do I want to phrase this? Americans think more about what Americans think and not what other people think about America, although that's also been changing in recent time. I mean, when we had our time of troubles of late, I think people are worried about what the rest of the world thinks about us. So these things do happen, but I have not seen any real interest on the part of my students in finding out what is taught of U.S. history in Poland. No, it hasn't gone that way. Frankly, most of the students that I teach tend to be focusing on European history, or at least in my course, they're certainly focusing on European history, not on American history. So perhaps the question is less germane, it's less pertinent to them.
Okay, so thank you very much. Well, that's what I thought, but obviously the focus of the students would be open enough, obviously, to ask this question if there was a question like that. I understand.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
My students ask questions all the time.
Okay.
When I give a lecture, it's not like this lecture I gave today with no interruptions. They interrupt all the time with questions, and I encourage that.
Thank you very much, Patrice. Thank you. Robert, would you like to summarize the event?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it is the big difference between America and Poland, because in America there are really in American university a lot of questions. So here in Poland, sometimes we have to encourage students to ask questions. So I do not see more questions here on Click Meeting platform. So Patrice, thank you very much once again. It was really great to have you here. Once again, I want to stress that it was a really great talk. Thank you once again. Thank you very much, Vice Rector, for supporting our event. Appreciate that. Thank you, all of you, that for coming, for participating in this discussion. Have a great day, Patrice, and have a good night to all our participants in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again.
Yes, but before you all go, let me just say a few words. Thank you so much, Patrice, for again accepting this invitation. Robert, thank you for moderating the sections. And I would like to say that there are many thank you notes also coming in. So thank you for the lecture as well. I wanted to invite you to just this last A+ lecture this year, which will happen next Monday. And it's going to happen on the 20th, on Monday at 5 p.m. GMT +1, so the Warsaw time. And the event will also be available through our meeting platform, but also broadcast through YouTube. So please join us next Monday. If you're interested in any of the events going on, please visit our website, www.apsl.edu.pl/en if it's for English, or just go to the main website. And also you can visit our Facebook pages, and all of the events are advertised there. And also the YouTube channel holds all the previous lectures as well. So there are recordings of those, including this one. So next Monday, we will listen to Professor Kwete from Agostino Neto University in Luanda, Angola. And this lecture will be about international security and terrorism in Africa. So let me invite you to this lecture next Monday, the last in the series this year, but there are new lectures coming in the new year. So because it's the end tonight, let me thank you once again. Thank you, Professor Dabrowski. Thank you, Robert. And well, let's meet next Monday. Goodbye and good night.